With these different summer books, I excluded a lot of the contemporary romances. A lot of those are more kind of have seasonal themes and have a lot of summer title ones. I'm not a big romance person. I don't mind if it's a subplot, but as far as like the genre itself, it's just not my favorite. So I excluded those, but I do have books that are literary fiction. I've got a little bit of horror, read a little bit of fantasy, nature writing, and so I would say it's more probably the literary contemporary fiction is what most of these fall into. And what I wanted to do with this video is, rather than just go over all the books, which I will, in any particular order, I wanted to look at the main themes of these different books that I found that are all placing themselves very, ostensibly in the summer season. It's in all its different ways that they mean that. Let's get into it. I have a few of the physical books, so I'll hold those up when they come, but I wanted to go real quick what I did read, and the ones I don't have, I'll throw up on the screen. What I've read so far, we'll go with the physical ones first, and I'll go over the other ones. I read Prodigal Summer by Barbara Kingsolver. I think I actually ended up doing that mostly on audio, but I had the library book just in case. Then I did Kakagori Summer by Emily E. Tommy. This one came out, I think, in 2025. Then I also read Summer by Allie Smith, part of her seasonal quartet. I think it's actually the last book in it, but I started with it, so there you go. I'll get to the other ones, I'm sure. And then I also read One Italian Summer by Rebecca Serli, I think's her name. That's how you say it. And then the last copy I've still got in my hands is The Last Summer of Reason by Tahar Jout. So, and then other ones I read, a couple I had on Kindle were Summer by Edith Wharton. I'll show that here. And then I also read The Summer War, which was a novella written by Naomi Novik. So that's the only one I read that was really straight fantasy. It's been a while since I've had read any fantasy books. And then I also read on audio, I had Last Summer on State Street by Toya Wolf. I had The Narrowboat Summer by Anne Youngson. And then here is The Summer Book by Tova Jansen. And then the last one that I did actually finish was Ghost Summer by Tanana Reeve Dew. And the one I'm hoping to finish today is the only one that's actually was like nonfiction nature writing per se, and that's The Summer World by Bern Heinrich. So that's all the books I actually read for the month. And now I'm going to go over each book real briefly. I don't want to give them any spoilers or anything, but I do want to talk about the themes I saw and how they kind of connect to this little group of, kind of what makes a book feel summery, And so Summer by Edith Wharton, I think, is the oldest of the books I read. It was written in the early 1900s. And it's about a girl who lives in this tiny town. It's a very traditional tiny town. She was born on the mountain, which is kind of like this wilderness of, where only outcasts are known to live. And so even though she was taken in very young by a family in town, she's always kind of seen as an outsider. And with very limited choices on like her path forward, it's her basic route, you find out pretty quick, is that she's expected to become betrothed to her adopted father, basically, because no one else will take her. But there's different themes that come up in this book. There's first love, there's a coming of age story. She goes through a lot in this one summer. There's a lot of writing about the natural world. I think it's kind of based in New England area. So there's a lot of, really beautiful nature writing, because she seems to feel most herself when she just gets to go lie in the grass and, look at the sky and look at the woods. And so there's some nice passages there. And she makes some hard decisions over this summer. It feels like it's kind of a getaway. She gets this bits of freedom, but then there's, things that come up and she has to make some hard choices towards the end of the summer, and kind of what her path forward after that is. And so that's Summer by Edith Wharton. Another audiobook that I read and mentioned is one that a lot of people have mentioned. It seems to come up every summer. If you hadn't read it before, it's a summer book by Tova Jansen. She did the Moomins animations, which I wasn't very familiar with, but apparently a lot of people are very fond of those. And it's about a girl and her grandmother and their beach house that they go to every summer with the girl's dad. And this summer seems to feel a little different, because they mention only briefly and very early on that the girl's mother's died. And she's hardly ever mentioned, but you can feel it, kind of that grief kind of on the edge of everything that they're doing, even as they're escaping and doing all these different adventures, and both kind of acting like kids and bickering. You know, it's sweet seeing the grandmother and the granddaughter interact, you know, and try to just get away for a little bit. But you know, it's a question of how much can you really get away. There's a lot of beautiful nature writing in that too. You know, it's set on this little island right off the coast of Finland, and so it's pretty idyllic, you know, setting. But it has its moments of, you know, of darkness and grief and anger. Even this little bubble that they try to protect, you know, and it kind of transitions to, you know, they're closing up towards the end of summer, you know, because it's not a place that they get to stay at forever. And then One Italian Summer by Rebecca Surley. It is also a novel that deals a lot with grief. You know, very early, I think even in the synopsis, that the main character, Katie, loses her mom to cancer. And so she is just absolutely overwhelmed with grief and decides to go ahead and take this trip that they had planned before her mother's pretty rapid decline, to the Amalfi Coast in Italy, you know, where her mother had lived at for a little time before Katie was born. And so Katie decides, you know, pretty spontaneously, and she's just going to go and just kind of escape over there. And it's its own bubble too. You know, she feels like it's going to be this getaway, and it is in more ways than she expects. There's some magical realism in this. And without going too much into it, she meets her mother from when she was there originally, like 30 years before. She meets a 30-year-old version of her mother, and they kind of have this summer together, you know, as Katie tries to figure out what's going on and deals with her grief and, you know, some other you know, subplots that happen also. This one wasn't my favorite for some, you know, different reasons, but did make me want to go visit the Amalfi Coast for sure. Next one I wanted to kind of cover real quick was Last Summer on State Street by Toya Wolf. And so that's a audiobook that I listened to. I believe it's her debut novel. I don't think she's written another one since, but it came out a few years ago. And it is about a girl named Fifi and her friends. They're all, I think, about 12 or so years old, and they live in this project housing in Chicago. And it's during an era when a lot of those were being knocked down. I think they're called the Robert Taylor homes. And they were getting knocked down kind of one by one. And they don't know exactly when they're building, when they're going to be told they have to move. But they feel like it's kind of closing in on them. And so the whole summer kind of deals with, you know, Fifi's world there. Her friendships, her conflicts within those friendships, you know, a lot of stuff that her brother's going through too. Fifi has to grow up pretty fast in this book too, so it's definitely coming of age. But overall, she's a sweet character. I enjoyed reading her and getting to kind of see how she deals with all the circumstances that get thrown at her. All right, sorry, she was whining, so I had to come bring her in. This is Pippa, little Chiweenie, who probably won't stay on my lap very long, so I'm gonna let her be. Here she goes. She just wanted to come in here and hang out. Anyway, The Prodigal Summer by Barbara Kingsolver. So that follows three characters. Deanna, who's the park ranger, and she lives in the Appalachian Mountains in a remote cabin. She meets a hunter out there and realizes they're very much at odds in terms of like their ideas of how they want to interact with nature and live with nature. But romance takes over between them anyway, you know, and everything that ensues from there. Then there's Lusa, who was a entomologist out of, I think, Louisville, Kentucky, and she meets a farmer, and they get married, and she moves out to the country. You know, she grew up in a city, and adjusting to in-laws, and through some circumstances has to figure out how to survive on a farm pretty quickly. And then there's Garnet, who is an older man who farmed cedar trees, and he's very kind of polite but kind of very cranky. He's in a semi-frenemy relationship with a neighbor down the road who they just have very different views about agriculture and nature conservation. So most of their interactions are more than bickering, but there's some unexpected or maybe expected turns with that too. And then I read The Narrowboat Summer by Anne Youngson. This one I kind of picked just from the cover when I was looking through Hoopla. It just looked a little different. So it's more of a cozy contemporary fiction. It's set in England with their canal system. There's an older woman there named Anastasia, who's well known among that kind of community, and she has her narrow boat that she goes up and down the canals of England, and she meets a couple of other women there who kind of just need escape from their circumstances. One's from her marriage, the other one's from her high pressure job, and they all just pretty quickly, abruptly just bond and hanging on this boat and deal with Anastasia's health issues and their own circumstances of trying to figure out what they want to do next. But they get to stay in this little bubble of the boat in summertime and meet some pretty odd characters along the way. All right, and then The Last Summer of Reason by Tahar Zhao, which is probably of all these books it's definitely the darkest of the books. It's an unfinished manuscript. It was written by Tahar Zhao. He was an Algerian journalist, writer, poet, and in the 90s there was a movement of religious extremism in the country that took over the government and kind of came after a big wave of violence against intellectuals and artists, and unfortunately he and many others were swept up in that and were killed. And this was a book that he was writing, so it's only about a novella kind of length, and it's about a bookseller who is living in a society in Algeria which is also being kind of taken over by this religious extremism. And then another book I read with Summer the title that was also pretty dark themes was Ghost Summer by Tananarive Due. A lot of her stories feature kids as protagonists or as like major characters, and they're all just through whatever they're facing having to grow up very quickly and make some hard decisions for their survival to protect their families. There's anything from different monsters they're dealing with to ghosts to she's got a few pandemic stories, pretty big variety. And Gracetown especially is a town that feels like it's kind of a getaway for some of the characters in these stories, until you find out it's not. Whatever you're running from, it is still going to find you one way or another, and you have to reckon with it. So it was a really excellent set of stories. And then there was Kakagori Summer by Emily Itami. This one I just finished a couple days ago. And it is about three sisters. There's Rei, Ai, and Kiki. And they are half British, half Japanese, but they grow up in Japan. And so you see pretty early on there's a scandal that happens to Ai, who's the youngest, and she's actually a J-pop idol. And because of this scandal, her sisters kind of converge and they come back. One was living in England and one was taking care of her young son as a single mom. And they all come back together to help her, and they run off to their family's summer home that they've been not as attached to since their mother's death. They have a lot of difficult feelings and grief with that town and that home, but they come because they're like, we have to get her out and get her somewhere as isolated as we can to see what we're going to do next. And of course their great grandmother is there. She's quite grumpy and very set in her ways, but there's little peaks of love that she does show eventually. But it's there's not a whole lot of plot. It's a lot of interior dialogue that jumps between these three sisters. But it's a nice slice of life in this town. That you also, once you read about it, you're like, oh, a summer there sounds pretty wonderful. And it is for them, but it does bring back all that grief that they've all tried to deal with in their own ways. Okay, and then I also read Summer by Ali Smith. Like I said before, she wrote a series of 4 novels that start with the fall. So it was autumn, winter, spring, summer. And of course I read summer first because, why not? But it kind of features a few different timelines, but mainly it's a teenage brother and sister in contemporary England. So it was around the time of Brexit and right around the time of the COVID pandemic. She features a lot of like current events in her writing, and the characters reacting at length about these current events. And so there's those two, and then also another pair of a brother-sister who are separated in the timeline that gets covered, but it's during World War II, and there's one in Europe, and then one in like on the continent of Europe, and then one in England, or actually on the Isle of Man, as you find out. And they're dealing with, consequences of the war and just trying to survive during that time. And you get to kind of see the connections that get built within these two very seemingly different narratives. And it's a coming of age for both of them under very different circumstances. One's much more, I think, immediately perilous, but there's hard things they both kind of deal with in their own way. And then there was The Summer War by Naomi Novik. I picked this one up kind of spontaneously. It's a novella that's about this kingdom dealing with what they call the Summerland. So it's kind of a portal into kind of a, D&D like Feywild. It gave me very much Feywild aesthetic world where they're frequently at war and battling with one another. And so there's a young girl named Celia who gets involved with the royal throne through different circumstances, and dealing with her brothers, and the aftermath of her getting really angry at her oldest brother when he leaves and cursing him unintentionally before she realizes she has any powers at all. So there's where between the Summerlands and sorcery, there's it's definitely a high fantasy themes to it, and she kind of figures out how to reckon with her mistakes and then fix everything that she can, and this brewing conflict between the two happening again. And then the last book that I read was called The Summer World by Bernd Heinrich. Bernd Heinrich is a naturalist, so I've read a few of his books, mainly Mind of the Raven. The Summer World itself is more about the cycle of summer and what he observes living in the New England area on his own property. It's a lot more entomology than I was expecting. I mainly came for birds, but there's a lot of discussion about different insects. It was a fun read in tandem with all these different books, and one that I'm hoping to finish today. We'll see. I imagine you can tell by my different outfit and lighting and the fact that I'm wearing the same shirt in another video I'm about to post that it's been a minute since I got to finish the rest of this review for July. I got a chance to go over all the books I read, but then before I got to go over some of the themes I had noticed and connections, I ran out of time that day, and it's been just a very chaotic few weeks since. And so we're back. Baby is napping, so I'm taking advantage of this chance. Well, I've got the monitor over here. So some themes I noticed between all these books. One, first of all, is summer as the idea of a bounded season. I think summer and winter kind of sit here, and they really have their bubbles in a sense, more so than spring and fall, which for me are more seasons of kind of a continuous transition. I think that's more of a psychological kind of sense to it, because I think they're all continuing to transform the entire time. But there's a sense, I think, of summer most of all being that kind of a beginning and end. I think especially in the US with our summer vacation, that has been ingrained for a long time now. There's this bubble we enter into. And so the books I saw do that the most were the ones that really featured like summer getaways. And so of those, there's the summer book, where you see the little girl and her grandmother, as soon as summer starts, they go to the island in Finland and set up everything and just stay there. And they stay there the entire time until it's time to close up at the end of the season and move back kind of to reality. But we stay with them just while they're in that bubble. at the start and at the end. So it's really encapsulates that season for them. You also see, I think, with one Italian summer in a couple ways. One, Katie, I believe, it's been a minute since I looked at these books, goes to Italy to mourn her mother and also just get away from everything else. And not only does she have that huge geographic jump where she's at to kind of give her that bubble, but then there's this weird, timey-wimey stuff going on when she meets her mother from 30 years before. And so that one has a kind of a magical realism also to it that makes it more of a little slice of time where she really gets to enjoy and stay in the height of summer and kind of process everything during that time. I also saw this come up a lot in Prodigal Summer by Barbara Kingsolver. Hers, of the fiction novels, I think was probably the most connected explicitly to like the natural world and talking about natural metaphors, as far as the plant life and animal life that these human characters kind of interact with or just live in the midst of. And so, in their crops, and they're tracking animals, and they're bickering with neighbors about, agricultural practices, you see them really kind of take on summer, in a different way that many of us may not think about who don't live in that kind of environment that is so up close, with nature as they do. And then the last one I was thinking of was Summer by Allie Smith. I think hers, it's really more the reflective writing that Allie does more than anything that makes me think of her treatment of summer as its own little getaway. It's built up to be this big event each year, and like something's got to happen and then we get to it and run all the way through it. But even before it's over, we're already mourning, seeing that the ending of it come back. It's kind of back to reality, back to this kind of from peak of life decline down towards the dead of winter. So that's the first theme I wanted to go over. So the next theme I saw for summer, what really helped tie it together was reading The Summer World by Bern Heinrich. He talks about summertime being kind of this peak of the volume load of life, of living things on Earth. That's peak of procreation, of mating, of breeding, and there's intense competition for resources during that time, and then everything kind of ebbs down again till each hemisphere kind of goes through their own winter. And so definitely where I saw this the most was in Prodigal Summer. Some of the romance arcs in that, you can tell Kingsolver plays with the metaphors of summer being like this, caught up in this frenzy of, it's time to, courtship and mating and procreating. There's discussion of, moth pheromones and, what are things that draw people to each other, just as what draws different animals together in courtship and mating. And so there's a lot of play with that. And then I also noticed it with Summer by Edith Wharton, which doesn't go into it nearly as explicitly as Prodigal Summer, but I think a little, maybe slightly scandalously, at its time, about 100 years before. You see the main character get caught up in the just general frenzy of summer, of young love, of, feeling like the world is just at its peak and full of life, and, she takes her chance to finally feel like she's full of life, and then all the consequences that play out from that. And then again, I mentioned it before just a bit ago, but One Italian Summer, I think, plays with this too. Katie takes advantage of being in this bubble of feeling like, okay, I can, kind of pretend my mom hasn't died while this other Carol from 30 years before is somehow here, and just really embraces everything, there is to offer where she is in Italy. The people she interacts with in different ways, and she really just gets kind of all caught up in those like sun-soaked days, without any responsibilities, kind of brush of love, several different relationships that way during her time there. And then the next theme I wanted to mention kind of plays into this, and that quote I mentioned from Summer by Allie Smith about kind of mourning the end of summer, because once that changes, feels like that's when real life is really going to come back at you, And in many of these books, there's this idea of a summer getaway and this rush when you first get there of like, okay, whatever we've been dealing with, it's out over there. We don't need to put it out of mind for now. But that reality check of even while you're away, that those things are not truly apart from us. Life doesn't stop happening to us. And so that happens in a lot of these books. One is Ghost Summer by Tananarive Due. Especially the Ghost Summer itself story. It's one of the longer short stories in that collection. They go to their grandparents for the summer, and it feels like it's this getaway they do every year. But there's different pressures of, their mother having gone away, and they're hearing these possibilities of their parents divorcing and trying to put that out of mind while they're gone. But then all that pain, I think, kind of interplays with, the ghosts and the paranormal activity that they run into while they're in town also. And just a lot of growing up really fast they have to do when they thought they might get a chance to escape from those things that were coming at them for a little while longer. And then I would say the other ones that I haven't talked about as much, but that do play with that. One is the Kakagori Summer. That's a good one for that one. I is a nationwide pop idol who gets thrown into scandal, and so her two sisters come and kind of rescue her back to this home where no one really knows they're at. No paparazzi does really get to them. But once they get there, they're dealing with previous traumas, things that they're struggling with now. I and her depression or kind of manic depression that she really is struggling with. She's genuine mental illness that she's going through. She's trying to heal from everything that's happened. And her other two sisters, one's dealing with raising her son and trying to manage finances, as a single mom, and try to keep everybody else happy, and try to suppress her own anger that she feels. And then the oldest sister, who came in from England, is, wrestling with going back to a job that she's successful at but miserable with, chance encounter with her ex-boyfriend, who you find out she really still cares a lot about, but just kind of closed that whole world off for herself. And then all of them are dealing with the fact that their mother, 15 years ago at that same family home, went to the beach and was never found again. And she had a lot of episodes of mental illness also, and so she's just presumed to have committed suicide and drowned herself. And they all have to contend with that trauma and the different ways they've dealt with it through that story. Even while they're trying to get away, they kind of get back to the center of what's been driving their different coping mechanisms and struggles. So that's, summer getaways are just summer getaways sometimes. All right, so another connection I saw with not all the books, but some of them, was in summer also, this sense of like a build-up or pressure cooker to a more violent climax, just with relationship stress and the heat. I think that kind of plays as like a good background setting for when things are slowly ratcheting up till they hit one night, and something fateful happens. And so there's a few of these books where you see that more than others. The main two I had for that were The Last Summer of Reason by Tahar Jout. So you see this, bookseller who is living in a country that's been overtaken by religious extremists, and his whole industry is under threat. They've been closing bookstores. So he's trying to kind of lay low, but also keep his business going, and resist however he can, but, at the same time not put himself so out there that he's just taken out immediately. And it just feels like the walls slowly close in on him, as his family leaves him, kind of converts over to the extremist side. You're not sure if it's genuine or if it's more just self-preservation, and he just can't make that leap. He's too attached to his books and to the ideas that he has encountered in them to let them go, even at risk of his life. And it all builds up to, the forced closure of his bookstore and his sense that, you know, it's not going to be too long for him, until he finally goes up and sits on this cliffside overlooking the city, and that's where it closes out at, is him kind of knowing what his fate's going to be before too long. It's not a satisfying ending, but that's because he never got a chance to finish that story because of what he was going through, living in Algeria in the 90s. And then another book that I've just mentioned at the beginning, but hadn't brought up in these yet, is Last Summer on State Street. That also kind of plays with this pressure cooker atmosphere, especially with the main character Fifi and her brother, who's a little older than her, and they're dealing with this escalation of gang violence and just general hostility building up in the area. Everybody's under severe stress, you know, between finances, not knowing if their apartment complex is going to get knocked down next or where they're going to go, you know, police overreactions. That's my dog whining. You know, she's in here. It all builds up to one fateful night where there's, you know, kind of a burst of violence, you know, that her brother gets caught up in, that one of her friends also gets caught up in. And it feels like the novel kind of hinges on that, because from then on, she moves on from those apartments, and it's a big time jump to her adulthood, looking back on where her other friends kind of branched off from that fateful night. That's kind of the central hinge of the novel, is that night when everything finally kind of explodes. Alright, so we'll see if she doesn't whine. She's probably going to leave in just a minute. Now she does these on camera, she gotta behave. But this is Pippa, little Chewini. So the last theme I wanted to mention that I think you can kind of see in a lot of the characters and plots that happen through these is, you know, connection between summer and youth or coming of age. You know, I think most of all, summertime feels like that little bubble when you're a kid growing up. That's when you feel like each summer something's going to change, you know, during the next few months. This is the next stage, or it's, you know, rites of passage, or just that chance to kind of escape school and get to do something, you know, really remarkable that you get to report back on when you do come back. And so that's why it feels like it's just like this kind of something's got to happen during this time of year more than any time else. And so a lot of these stories are just general coming of age novels. You know, Last Summer on State Street is definitely one. She has to grow up in quite a hurry just over this one summer. You know, and you see how that kind of plays out for each of these girls. And she's gone again. So that didn't last long. She was ready to get out of the room. And so, yeah, a lot of these stories are coming of age stories that kind of happen over one summer. Last Summer on State Street definitely is one. You know, she's a young teen who has to kind of grow up in a hurry along with her friends as they deal with everything that's coming to bear down on them over this summer season, and then how that affects them later on their adulthood when she's looking back. Summer by Edith Wharton also is coming of age. She goes through a lot of, you know, new experiences and has to make some very tough choices through that summer for herself. And then also, I want to say One Italian Summer, even though she is like about 30-ish, you know, so it's not so much that, but she does do a lot of maturing. You know, I struggled with Katie for a lot of it as a protagonist because she felt just so self-centered and obsessive with her mom and dependent, and I was just like, you know, to the point of kind of resenting anybody else for daring to grieve her. But she does do some character development through the novel. I don't know, I have other issues with that book, but she does do some changes. You know, those behaviors of hers are kind of thrown back at her for her to be a little more insightful about. I will credit it that. And then also, in terms of other younger characters that are growing up, Ghost Summer by Tananarive Due, a lot of those characters, she has a lot of characters that are, you know, are kids, just are under 10 or might be tweens, who get thrown into these really difficult, you know, mysteries and situations and have to make choices, and sometimes don't have adults there to help guide them on that. I think that's part of what makes her stories, for me, so tense, is because I don't want anything to happen to these kids. You know, and usually they're very wise and insightful for their age, but they're still just so vulnerable, and just the way they have to grow up so quick, sometimes it's heartbreaking, you know. And then Summer by Ali Smith also, especially the two like teenage characters. You see them both kind of confront different things that they're dealing with, and they do some maturing too, you know, and maybe even their mom a little bit, you know, who was not, I felt like in some ways not very much more mature than they were, but she kind of has some insights over the summer as well. Okay, we're just gonna keep on rocking. Baby's still napping, we're making it. So my personal favorites, so if I had to pick three, it would be probably third place, which was kind of a surprise for me, was Kakagori Summer. It was one of the ones I knew the least about. I just found it going through my library's catalog. I don't think it was the greatest writing, but it was straightforward, it was readable. But I enjoyed the sisters and seeing their interactions, and I just felt like the grief that they all went through, you know, it felt genuine to me. I could connect with them on that, and I cared about them and kind of where they were going to be going after the story ended. So between that and just that kind of idyllic coastal Japan, you know, atmosphere, I enjoyed that book much more than I was expecting. After that, it would probably be Ghost Summer by Tananarive Due, which again, I don't read a whole lot of horror or suspense, but I really enjoyed her other book, The Reformatory. You know, it really was difficult for me to read at times. And these stories hit the similar areas of tension for me too. One of the stories, you know, in particular of a boy who is, you know, almost mute from trauma of losing his parents, and he's being raised by his grandfather in this kind of zombie apocalypse, brought me to tears. You know, I was like, okay, I have to finish this, and I just let myself cry while I listened to the rest of that story. But I enjoy her writing. I enjoy the themes that she plays with. I enjoy the kid protagonist more than I would expect. And she just hits that fine line of, you know, inciting that kind of fear and anxiety. And then I think my favorite book that I read in July was the Summer book by Tove Jansson. It just has a lot of things I like in it. It was quiet, it was reflective, enjoyed the dialogue, the natural setting, and it was a simple story, but the things that it said and the things that you could kind of read between the lines, I thought were pretty moving, you know, and profound at times. And so, you know, the ones that gave me the most like heartful feeling when I finished, I would say that was the most successful one for me this month. I wanted to mention just some other books when I was looking through what I've read before that also really signify summer to me, even if they don't have summer in the title, you know, because we don't all have to be that literal like I was for July. And so I want to kind of touch on those. I recommend them as well because they touch on some other genres that I didn't really play with this month. So the first one is Sag Harbor by Colson Whitehead. He is known for other books like The Nickel Boys, The Underground Railroad. And this one follows Benji. He's a teenager, and every summer his family goes to this Sag Harbor. So it's this affluent black community that has vacation homes off the coast of New England. I'm blanking on where at the moment, but in that general area. And they all kind of get together every summer, so everybody kind of knows everybody through the last couple generations. And, you know, Benji goes looking forward to, you know, just the different other people they run into there, his work at ice cream shop. And then there's also heavier themes though. There's a lot of conflict with Benji's dad that he sometimes will speak more directly about, but it kind of builds up in hints through the book, especially when his parents actually come to stay with them. They're mostly kind of on their own for a lot of the summer, but things come more to a head a little later on when his parents actually come to stay towards the end. And there's some coming of age, you know, and ways that Benji, I don't think anticipates, but yeah, he does do some growing up. So yeah, Sag Harbor I think is a great summer read. And then these next couple are more YA novels. I don't read much of those, but I do want to recommend these because they are more summertime, and I like them okay, you know. I finished them. So one was We Were Liars by E. Lockhart. I think that's a pretty well-known one. Again, it's this kind of extended family that gets together on their family property for a beach vacation. every year. But you know, there's something that happens one summer, and the main character, she doesn't really recall what it was, and then she comes back and everybody kind of hints around it. There's different stories, and there's just ratcheting up of tension until things kind of explode all over again over what happened that previous summer. You know, and there's a little bit of magical realism, I remember, in it, and young love, and just lots of feelings and drama and summer, you know, beach time. So yeah, it's got the vibes for it. The other YA novel I wanted to mention was The Last True Poets of the Sea by Julia Drake. There's some, you know, similar connections here. It talks a lot about grief and young love. It's not, I don't think, as dramatic as We Were Liars, but it has some interesting themes in it. And then I also wanted to mention A Room with a View by E.M. Forster. I believe it takes place mostly or partly over a summer, but it has similar themes of like this getaway, this, you know, European vacation and chance encounters and, you know, young love, but also dealing with social conventions. You know, you have this little bubble where you can kind of pretend those aren't there, but then, you know, everything kind of comes back to land on you as far as what you should be doing and your role in life and who you really can make a life with, you know, as far as not upsetting everybody else and, you know, affecting your own reputation and the pressure of that. And so that's, yeah, A Room with a View, I think would be a good summertime classic to read. I was also thinking about a novel I read a couple years back that was very popular, so you probably have heard of it or read it, most likely. The God of the Woods by Liz Moore. It is a mystery thriller that takes place over a summer camp season in the Adirondacks. And you see similar things. You see family drama, you see this getaway of a summer camp, but things come to bear down on that camp and some of the people there, and this build up towards this climax of violence, and it, you know, it jumps chapters and perspectives a lot, and you see it kind of ratcheting up till you finally get to the peak of that violence, but also the peak of this other parallel mystery of another missing case. Yeah, it's a good one if you want like summertime tension, suspense reading. And then the last one I'll mention, which also has some similar vibes to God of the Woods, is The Hunter by Tana French. I have only read so far the first couple of books Tana French has written about Cal Hooper. He's like a Chicago detective who retires into rural Ireland and, you know, trying to build his little old cottage that he bought out. But he's getting caught up in these, you know, mysteries and violence that he probably did not anticipate in this little quarter of the world that looks so idyllic. And so this is another mystery, so I'm not going to reveal any of the spoilers about it. It does play with some characters in the first book, so if you kind of want to get that full context, you probably ought to read the first one, which I think is The Searcher. But The Hunter it's placed differently because it's built over a summer, and there's a heat wave coming through, and it's kind of getting to everybody while they're dealing with this different mysteries and issues that are happening in the community as well, and kind of up the mountain too. And so it's a good one at building up that pressure cooker until everything finally kind of, you know, explodes out too, and then they have to deal with the fallout. All right, so I think I have talked plenty in covering what I read in July. I would love to hear what you think of these books, if you've read any of them or interested in them, but also most of all, I'd like to know what you think are also kind of prime summertime reads for, you know, what makes you think of summer, what are your beach reads or summer camp reads, or just whatever brings you to mind of your summertime memories and, you know, the books that are connected to that. So yeah, let me know, but hopefully you're all staying cool as you can. We're trying over here. And I hope you all have a good rest of your day. Thanks. Bye.